If Donald Trump is elected, American life could become more expensive. Currently, Trump is leading the 2024 presidential race largely due to strong voter support from those who believe he is better at controlling inflation compared to his opponent. This seems contradictory, as Trump has been openly promoting plans that could lead to higher consumer prices. As of mid-September 2024, an NBC News poll shows Trump leading in the race for the White House with 46% to 44% nationwide. However, when asked which candidate is better at handling inflation and the cost of living, Trump's Republican Party outperforms Biden's Democrats by 22 percentage points. Trump's notable lead in managing prices is striking, given that inflation is currently considered the most pressing issue facing the U.S. Unfortunately, Trump does not have a concrete and feasible plan to control inflation. Indeed, the Republican Party and his economic advisors have proposed financial policies that risk worsening inflation. This claim is based not only on indirect analysis but also on specific proposals from Trump that could directly drive up consumer prices. Here is a summary of the Republican candidate's 4-point plan that could make American life more expensive. Step 1. Devalue the U.S. dollar. Since the COVID-19 pandemic, inflation has caused significant challenges for consumers in most wealthy countries around the world. However, Americans have a slight advantage over citizens of other countries because their currency is relatively strong and stable. The U.S. economy is growing nearly twice as fast as most other major economies without experiencing significantly higher inflation. However, the Federal Reserve still maintains relatively high interest rates to control inflation. The combination of rapid economic growth and high interest rates has driven strong demand for the U.S. dollar. Foreign investors want to invest in robustly growing countries with high returns but low government bond risks. As a result, many foreign investors are converting their local currencies into U.S. dollars, increasing the value of the dollar. Consequently, American wages can buy more imported goods thanks to the strength of the dollar. However, Trump's economic advisors want to change this situation. According to Politico, senior policy aides to the former president are actively discussing ways to weaken the value of the U.S. dollar. If Trump is elected for a second term, their rationale is fairly straightforward. Although a strong dollar benefits American consumers, it disadvantages U.S. exporters by making their goods more expensive for potential overseas customers. Since Trump and former Trade Representative Robert Lighthizer have always prioritized boosting domestic production and improving America's trade balance, they are willing to sacrifice consumer benefits to achieve their goals for U.S. manufacturers. Lighthizer is said to plan to pressure other countries to raise the value of their currencies by threatening to impose tariffs on their exports if they do not comply. Additionally, Trump's senior advisors are considering measures to weaken the dollar without requiring cooperation from other countries. Moderate viewpoints may vary on whether the current U.S. dollar is too strong. Many analysts, both conservative and liberal, believe the U.S. has a national interest in maintaining and developing domestic production capabilities, and if other factors remain constant, a strong dollar will weaken the competitiveness of U.S. exports. On the other hand, only about 8.6% of the U.S. workforce is employed in manufacturing, suggesting that most Americans are more concerned with affordable imports than competitive exports. Furthermore, there is reason to suspect that Trump's plan could backfire, as many foreign governments might retaliate by devaluing their currencies and imposing tariffs on U.S. goods, potentially weakening their own currencies. However, even if one supports Lighthizer's priorities and proposals, an undeniable fact is that a literal plan to devalue the U.S. dollar will indeed make imported goods more expensive for American consumers. Many Americans are likely to disagree with this approach. Step 2. Impose a 10% tariff on all foreign imports to boost domestic production. Trump and his advisors are considering implementing a 10% tariff on all imported goods. This would likely mean that American consumers would pay approximately 10% more for items like cars, electronics, toys, and other foreign-produced goods. In theory, the tax burden could fall more heavily on foreign producers rather than American consumers. If the tariff only applies to raw materials such as soybeans or wheat from a specific country, the exporter from that country might lower their prices in response, as many countries export similar raw materials, and the targeted producer might lose market share in the U.S. if they do not offset the impact of the tariff by reducing prices. In that case, Americans would not pay more for imports, but the affected foreign producer would have to accept lower profits. However, a general import tariff would not work this way. Americans import more processed goods than raw materials, and the U.S. economy cannot produce enough raw material inputs at the low costs that foreign companies can provide. Producers of specialized products like advanced semiconductors know that Americans have no alternative, so they are less motivated to lower prices. Studies have shown that when Trump imposed tariffs on Chinese goods, Americans paid nearly the entire cost. While protected from foreign competition by the tariffs, U.S. manufacturers could raise prices without fearing a loss of customers. As a result, consumer prices surge. Since Trump's 10% import tariff would act as a consumption tax on foreign goods, it would reduce American consumers' purchasing power. When goods become unaffordable and consumers cut back on spending, inflation could theoretically slow down. Step 3. Implement large tax cuts funded by budget deficits. The top financial priority of the Republican Party in 2025 would be to extend the tax cuts made during Trump's presidency. Many provisions of the 2017 tax cut package will expire at the end of next year. Maintaining these policies would increase the federal budget deficit by an additional $3.3 trillion over the next decade, according to estimates by the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, CRFB. However, Trump is not satisfied with merely maintaining current tax levels in the U.S. Instead, his team hopes to continue reducing the corporate tax rate from 21% to 15%, which would increase the budget deficit by an additional $522 billion, according to the conventional assumptions of the Tax Foundation, a conservative economic think tank. Additionally, the former president hopes to implement a large tax cut for the middle class. According to a recent Reuters report, Trump and his advisors are considering reducing federal personal income taxes or lowering high-income tax rates for middle-class households. Since the scale of these tax cuts has not been quantified, it is difficult to estimate their exact financial cost. However, because the American middle class is so large, any significant tax cut for them would be very expensive. At first glance, cutting taxes for the middle class seems like it would make American lives more comfortable, at least in the short term, if the policy does not pose a risk of bringing inflation back. Unfortunately, that risk always exists. If Americans' after-tax income increases by hundreds of billions of dollars, they would suddenly have the capacity to increase spending on goods and services dramatically. If the economy's production capacity does not increase accordingly, demand will outstrip supply, and consumers will pay higher prices. In theory, the Republicans could implement massive tax cuts totaling trillions of dollars without causing inflation, but this would require balancing by cutting spending correspondingly. Extending the 2017 tax cuts and reducing the corporate tax rate to 15% would cost around $4 trillion in budget revenue. Middle-class tax cuts could easily push that number to $6 trillion. During both Trump and Bush's presidencies, the Republicans have never cut spending to levels close to this amount. More importantly, to avoid inflation from the tax cuts in 2025 and 2026, spending needs to be cut immediately, not in a few years. But the Republicans do not want to cut current Medicare and Social Security benefits. Cutting $6 trillion in spending without touching benefits would require eliminating most social welfare programs. Therefore, the easiest path is to let the budget deficit increase. This could lead to faster price increases and require significant interest rate hikes. Assuming the Republicans find some way to increase the economy's production capacity, their tax cut plan would cause less inflation, and Americans might benefit in the short term, at least until the effects of cutting Medicare and Social Security benefits hit them. But Trump's team plans to do the opposite, shrink the U.S. economy's supply. This is the final step in their inflation-promoting agenda. Step 4. Shrink the U.S. workforce. As reported by the New York Times in November 2023, Trump and former White House advisor Stephen Miller have planned to expel millions of undocumented immigrants during Trump's second term, even without congressional support. Currently, procedural rights limit the government's ability to expel undocumented immigrants en masse. However, Miller and Trump believe they can narrow these rights under current executive authority. They plan to quickly expel all undocumented immigrants who have been in the U.S. for less than 2 years, meaning the government would have the authority to expel them without giving them a chance to appeal in court. Existing laws make it harder to deport long-term immigrants, but Trump's team believes they can force millions of them to leave the U.S. first. They will expand raids on workplaces and areas with high concentrations of undocumented immigrants. Then, those arrested will be held indefinitely in federal detention centers. They still have the right to appeal to the courts but will have to wait years for the legal process while in jail. Miller believes most will choose to leave the U.S. rather than face detention. There are strong moral reasons to oppose these policies. Even Americans who do not sympathize with undocumented immigrants have economic reasons to oppose mass deportations. As scholars at the Brookings Institution have pointed out, the increase in immigration since the pandemic is a major reason the U.S. has managed to control inflation without falling into recession. Foreign labor has increased the economy's production capacity, helping supply keep pace with rising consumer demand. Conversely, if the U.S. were to suddenly expel all undocumented labor, the labor shortage would devastate many industries from real estate to agriculture to healthcare, and prices would quickly soar. Some Americans might view the labor shortage caused by mass deportations as beneficial. After all, when labor is scarce, workers can demand higher wages. But the number of undocumented workers in the U.S. is much larger than the number of unemployed people. Mass deportations would not leave native workers with a better paying job market. Instead, it would shrink the economy as millions of current jobs simply disappear. In agriculture, reduced labor will make food scarce and more expensive. The same principle applies to construction, hospitality, entertainment, and healthcare sectors. Combining all these factors, we have a formula to push U.S. inflation back to 9%. Devalue the dollar, isolate American manufacturers from competition, stimulate consumer demand with tax cuts, and then shrink the supply by mass deportations. Prices would certainly soar this way. Unfortunately, Trump's proposals and their potential economic consequences seem to be largely ignored by American voters, possibly because these issues have not received much media attention. If this does not change by November 2024, the US may pay a heavy price for it. Thank you for watching the video on our channel. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button below to support the team.